William Blake is considered a key figure in esotericism. A visionary artist, he transformed his experiences and perceptions into poetry and images, creating his own symbolic universe in which imagination becomes the key to unlocking the hidden. In this video, we will explore his life and work, seeking to understand the complex, mystical, and esoteric system he developed. William Blake, born in London in 1757, was a poet, engraver, and painter. His life and work were deeply marked by visionary experiences that sparked in him a lasting fascination with esoteric symbolism and mysticism. From childhood, he claimed to have extraordinary encounters. At the age of 8, he said he saw a tree filled with angels, and later he reported witnessing the apparition of his deceased brother's spirit. These experiences cemented his conviction that a spiritual reality existed beyond the material world. Blake lived during a period of transition between the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, yet he firmly rejected both currents. He criticized the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment and denounced the Industrial Revolution, which he saw as the beginning of a dehumanizing era. Against the mechanical and materialistic vision of thinkers like Locke or Newton, he chose a mystical and highly symbolic outlook. At the age of 14, he began training as an engraver under James Bessier, a renowned craftsman connected to the Society of Antiquaries of London. During 7 years of apprenticeship, he mastered engraving, drawing, and painting techniques, gaining great technical precision and exposure to a world of symbols and archetypes that would permeate all his work. As an adult, he developed his own technique that combined engraving and painting, merging image and poetry into a single piece. He also cultivated the habit of spending long hours in bookshops, which in 18th century London served as meeting places for intellectuals, artists, occultists, revolutionaries, and mystics, spaces where, in addition to buying books, people engaged in intense debates on hidden realities and ideas. He especially frequented the shop of Joseph Johnson, publisher of authors such as Emanuel Swedenborg and Thomas Paine. Johnson quickly recognized Blake's talent, hiring him to produce engravings for his publications and inviting him to the gatherings of writers and artists he hosted. The bookshop offered a wide range of literature, but was particularly notable for its extensive collection of esoteric texts. It was there that Blake encountered the works of Paracelsus, Hermes Trismegistus, Thomas Vaughan, Plato, Robert Fludd, Agrippa, and Pico della Mirandola, among others. However, the most decisive influence was Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish mystic who claimed to have conversed directly with angels and maintained that true reality was spiritual, while matter was nothing more than a fleeting illusion. These ideas profoundly shaped Blake, who attended meetings of the New Jerusalem Church, founded by Swedenborg's followers after his death, and was even a member of the Swedenborg Society of London for a time. For a time, Blake actively promoted Swedenborg's ideas. However, as the years passed, he began to distance himself. While he acknowledged Swedenborg's value as a visionary and explorer of spiritual realities, he believed he remained constrained by a traditional moralism that divided good and evil too rigidly. Blake aspired to something deeper. He saw human imagination as an extension of the universal creative act, a divine spark or flame. Thus, although he was inspired by Swedenborg's mysticism and his conception of the afterlife, he ultimately regarded it as a starting point that needed to be surpassed. This stance was no small matter, as Swedenborg enjoyed great prestige in esoteric circles and discreet societies of his time. He was a key figure for 17th century Rosicrucian thought and exerted a strong influence on Swedish Freemasonry. The Swedish Rite, consolidated at the end of that century, adopted several aspects of his Christian esoteric vision, especially his concepts of the soul, heaven, and the afterlife. Even so, while this perspective had a distinctly esoteric character, it did not entirely break with the Christian tradition. In the context of the Swedish Rite, Swedenborg functioned as a bridge between religion and occult philosophy. Blake moved in circles of radical intellectuals where he crossed paths with revolutionaries and Enlightenment thinkers, an environment that reinforced his criticism of organized religion and traditional morality. His stance did not stem from atheism, but from a heterodox spirituality. He considered himself a Christian, yet interpreted that tradition in his own way. He believed that early Christianity had been a mystical religion that encouraged imagination and inner freedom, but that over time it had been distorted under the weight of dogma, politics, and materialism. To most of his contemporaries, Blake was an eccentric, and London society marginalized him for his ideas. Still, that never stopped him. He continued to develop his mythology and mystical system, always leading a modest life. In his later years, he managed to gather a small circle of disciples and patrons who recognized his visionary genius, though true recognition only came after his death when occultists and scholars of symbolism rediscovered his legacy. This trajectory has led many to wonder whether Blake actually belonged to any esoteric order or was formally initiated into the occult. There is no evidence or testimony to confirm this, yet his work and worldview reveal a deep knowledge of occult philosophy and symbolism. Some historians of esotericism have suggested that he may have had connections with Freemasonry based on his environment and the evident presence of Masonic symbols in his work, symbols that, in the 18th century, could only be known through initiation. There are no certainties, but there are striking coincidences, from the physical proximity of his training grounds to London's most important Masonic institutions, to his friendships and collaborations with known Freemasons, and his participation in the Swedenborg Society, which was linked to Enlightenment currents with strong Masonic influence. In any case, even if he was not an institutional occultist, the nature of his work is profoundly esoteric. He did not write manuals of magic or treatises on alchemy, but he created something more unique, a cosmology of his own, a vision of the world as a stage for the struggle between forces seeking to subdue the imagination and those striving to set it free. But before we continue with the analysis, I'd like to remind you that many of the paintings you'll see throughout this video are available for you to collect. In the description, you'll find a link to the William Blake collection, where you can explore his works in detail and purchase the one you like most to have in your home. Shipping is completely free worldwide, and by making a purchase, you'll also be supporting me in continuing to create videos like this one. Now, let's continue. For Blake, imagination was not merely an act of fantasy or a tool for inventing stories, but a spiritual faculty capable of connecting human beings with the infinite. He believed that ideas were made of the same mysterious substance as visions and dreams, and that if ultimate reality was spiritual in nature, only the imaginative gaze could access it. Hence his famous statement, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." By this, he meant that the physical senses offer us only a limited version of reality. His thought clashed with the enlightenment of his time, which reduced knowledge to what could be measured, touched, or seen. While Enlightenment philosophers saw imagination as a secondary product of perception, for Blake it was the very foundation of existence. He envisioned the cosmos as an interconnected whole, where the human mind, the microcosm, mirrored the divine universe, the macrocosm. He summed it up in the phrase, "God is in the lowest effects as well as in the highest causes," a way of recognizing the divine spark within humanity itself. He even identified Jesus Christ with the divine imagination, calling him the divine imagination and linking him to the creative or mercurial principle in humankind. For this reason, his theology was often considered Gnostic or Hermetic. Like the ancient Gnostics, he distinguished between a lesser God, the lawgiver bound to the material world, Jehovah Elohim, and a higher God associated with spirit, Jesus, the archetype of forgiveness and imagination. He interpreted the creation and the fall in Genesis as an allegory of a cosmic accident. Humanity, originally united with the divine, fell into matter and became confined by the perception of the senses. In his system, Christ represented the imagination and creative love that could free humanity from the prison of law, matter, and the senses. His visions of angels, demons, and biblical figures were understood as manifestations of eternal truths, what we would now call archetypes, that appeared to him in familiar images, in his case rooted in Christianity. This form of spirituality brought him into conflict with official religion and Victorian morality. He criticized the repressive ethics that, in his view, stifled natural desires and undermined the life of the spirit. From this arose his dualistic vision, in which heaven and hell were not physical places or post-mortem destinies, but states of the soul and ways of perceiving reality. Heaven symbolized law, reason, and order, but also dogma, repression, and rigidity. Hell, by contrast, represented energy, creative desire, and passion, as well as subversion and chaos. For Blake, desire and energy were expressions of the divine vitality within humans, while reason was the force that could either organize them or, when misused, repress them. In his mythology, this opposition took shape in two figures: Urizen, the old god of reason and law, and Orc, the rebellious spirit of passion and revolution. The tension and eventual reconciliation between reason and imagination, order and chaos, heaven and hell, was the core of his entire body of work. He embraced the union of opposites central to Hermetic and alchemical thought, using it to construct a personal mythology that became a complex, mystical, and prophetic system. He summed it up in a now famous declaration: "I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's." Blake did not set out his system in a single volume. Instead, he developed it over more than 3 decades, between 1789 and 1820, through poems, engravings, and illustrations. Along this journey, standout works include The Book of Urizen, The Book of Loss, America, a Prophecy, Europe, a Prophecy, Milton, a poem, and above all, Jerusalem, considered one of the great esoteric works in history. To understand his work, it's important to remember that Blake never separated poetry from image. He spoke in images and painted with words. His artistic goal was to achieve a total unity in which word and form were integrated as a single living entity. Jerusalem is a prophetic work engraved on copper plates using his own technique, illuminated relief printing, in which he combined text and illustration, later hand-coloring the pages. In this book, he brought together and gave final structure to all the elements of his system. Within this symbolic universe, several characters and archetypes stand out. Urizen embodies abstract reason, law, intellect, and authority, both religious and scientific. He represents the force that separates the mind from the imagination and the body, resembling the Gnostic demiurge associated with repression and rigid order. Orc, by contrast, is his opposite. He symbolizes vital rebellion, passion, creative desire, and the transformative impulse. Where Urizen sets limits, Orc breaks them. He is a Promethean or Luciferian figure who brings the fire of change, though without balance, he can fall into chaos. Loss is the archetype of creative and artistic imagination. A redemptive yet tragic figure, he suffers as he contemplates a broken world and seeks to restore it through his art. In his eternal forge, he shapes forms with spiritual fire. His companion Anitharmon represents the feminine principle of emotion. She can inspire visions but also embody repressive sexual morality and mystery. She is also the mother of Orc, linking her to the birth of desire and rebellion. Albion is the primordial man before the fall, equivalent to the Adam Kadmon of Kabbalah or the Gnostic Anthropos. He represents both universal humanity and the individual soul in its integrated state. His fall fragments him into the 4 Zoas, Urizen, Los, Tharmas, and Luva, or Urthona, each reflecting an aspect of the human psyche. Tharmas embodies the body, the senses, and instinct. Urthona is the spiritual facet of imagination, linked to loss. Other key archetypes include Vala, who represents the world of appearances and the veil of illusion, divine wisdom in its fallen form, and Rintrah, the symbol of righteous indignation and prophetic wrath, a voice denouncing injustice without being driven by desire, unlike Orc. Together, these characters form the central cast of Blake's cosmic drama, which tells the tragic creation of the universe, the emergence of good and evil, and the hope of final redemption. In one of his most recognized works, The Ancient of Days, Blake depicts Urizen, the demiurge. The figure, leaning forward with an ambiguous expression, appears at once to be creating duality, the material world, and measuring the darkness of the abyss with a compass. With this image, Blake delivers a double critique. On one hand, of the authoritarian God of the Old Testament, and on the other, of the rationalist mindset dominant in his time. In traditional esoteric iconography, the compass represents the architect of the universe and the divine reason that orders creation. Blake, however, gives it a Gnostic and darker nuance, the demiurge who limits infinite reality, enclosing it within the geometry of the material. Urizen's hunched posture conveys the sense that his creative act is also an act of descent. There is no grandeur or triumph, but weight and gravity, as though the spirit were falling into matter, an inversion of celestial values. From this perspective, the Ancient of Days is not the representation of a benevolent creator god, but of a principle which, in its effort to impose order, ends up repressing and confining what is alive, spontaneous, and creative. Even the golden halo surrounding him is not the full divine light, but the light of reason that only appears to be truth, yet remains incomplete, for the circle is left open. For Blake, order and reason were necessary, but they had to serve spiritual vision and creative imagination. This is why the work embodies the tension between reason that illuminates and reason that imprisons. In summary, William Blake was a complete creator, poet, painter, mystic, and esoteric thinker whose entire body of work can be understood as a symbolic system of his own making. Influenced by Hermetic tradition, Kabbalah, and Gnosticism, he reinterpreted these currents within a Christian aesthetic to deliver a transformative message: imagination as the divine spark, the world as the great work of art of the spirit, and salvation as a new way of seeing reality. His most important works function as true treatises of occult philosophy, filled with archetypes and universal myths: the fall of the soul, the struggle against oppressive forces, and redemption through inner light. Although his imagery was close to Christian mysticism, his thought was deeply linked to Western esotericism. At the height of rationalism, Blake emerged as a solitary, self-taught initiate, capable of reimagining ancient symbols to give them new meaning. His greatest gift was to take that esoteric legacy and recreate it not as an academic, but as a myth maker, shaping his own symbolic narratives in images that act as living symbols and bearers of prophetic messages. His esoteric Christianity placed creative imagination at the center and opposed the dominant rationalism of his era. While rejecting the cold, mechanistic thought of his time, he did not fall into irrationality. He saw a higher synthesis, a poetic reason capable of recognizing and reconciling opposites. For him, awakening from material illusion meant cleansing the doors of perception to behold the infinite. He saw imagination not as a passive pastime, but as a sacred faculty through which the soul could create, redeem, and access the divine within itself. Too heterodox for religion and too independent for organized esotericism, Blake is now considered one of the most influential figures in modern esoteric art. He was the heir of the enlightened occultism of the 17th century, seeking to unite magic, alchemy, Kabbalah, and religion, and at the same time, a forerunner of many themes later developed in contemporary esotericism. It is no coincidence that the pre-Raphaelites, symbolists, and Victorian occultists revived his work, seeing in him a natural initiate, someone who, in solitude, managed to lift part of the veil of Isis. Thank you for watching until the end, and don't forget you can find his paintings available at inspiragio.com. See you in the next video.